Hello, welcome to Empty Bowl Games. My name is Walker. As you can tell, this video is not about Appraisal, even though in my last video we said we were working on a demo. We're still working on it. Keep an eye out. In the meantime, I took a creative break and made this project, so let's get into talking about that. Line is a 1D platformer that I made by myself in a month, and this video will act as a devlog and a post-mortem at the same time, so it's going to be pretty exhaustive about every detail. So Line is a game that takes place only on the x-axis. How can a platformer take place only on one axis? Well, if you're interested, I would recommend playing the game first. This video spoils the entire puzzle and purpose of the game, so if you're interested in experiencing it firsthand, it takes about 20 to 30 minutes and it's free to download on itch.io. The download link is in the description. So the story leading up and the reason that I started this project is pretty simple. I was burnt out on Appraisal and I wanted to take a creative break and work on something different for a short period of time. When I came up with the 1D idea, it felt like a worthwhile experiment to explore. And so what I'm going to talk about first is the inspirations that led me there. So the first primary inspiration is that I listened to way too many Jonathan Blow talks and played his games. So to those unfamiliar, Jonathan Blow is the creator of two games. One of them is Braid and the other one is The Witness. They are very challenging puzzle games that take advantage of and push the medium of video games in very important and exciting ways. And he's a really interesting figure, and though there's a lot that I don't agree with him on, he's still really fascinating to listen to and has some unique ideas. Honestly, some of the best presentations I've ever seen on video games were given by him. Even though sometimes they can be quite abstract and high level, I think they're really worthwhile watches and listens. And so I listened to some of his talks. I replayed Braid, I listened to more of his talks, and then I played The Witness. I actually started The Witness, came up with 1D, finished 1D, and then went back and beat The Witness. Either way, I found it really interesting to see the depth he was able to take the medium of games to with his interesting puzzles and his focus on nonverbal communication, especially in The Witness. And I found Blow's ideas in his games and in his talks valuable and insightful, and he was really pushing the medium in interesting and real ways. He's really not all talk. While playing The Witness, more than once I found myself saying out loud, he's gotten away with it again. And just when puzzles had particularly strong moments of epiphanies or had really cool and fun ways that they twist the concept into really interesting ideas. I also honestly, 1D has no main menu, and that's definitely inspired by The Witness having no main menu. Having no main menu made sense with 1D. It made it feel more minimal, and it also removed any possibility of having a 2D component within the game before the game was over. And so nonverbal communication was something that I've been very interested in, but the extremity that Jonathan Blow takes it in his games is really inspired the design decisions in 1D. You know, no big narratives, no cutscenes, sections of people talking, hand-holding tutorials. He's really interested in what games can do uniquely and teaching the player through the game alone, and I really took that design ethos to heart. The second thing that inspired me is the game Hyperdemon, which, funnily enough, I've not played Hyperdemon. I purchased Hyperdemon now after the fact, but I still haven't played it yet. And what inspired me from Hyperdemon wasn't the game itself. Well, I'm going to say it's half the game itself. It looks amazing. Its trailer is one of my favorite trailers ever. But what really inspired me was the idea of what it seemed like to play Hyperdemon. And so it was the comments and the reviews in particular that inspired me. So take this review from howlongtobeat.com. I don't understand what's going on, but my brain does. and there's tons of comments and reviews that say pretty much the same thing, and this idea really fascinates me. It pairs well with the topics Jonathan Blow had talked about, the idea that something is nonsensical, yet you can get to the point where you can act on it competently in the space of the game. It's a way of understanding through games, and bringing that understanding into language or trying to explain it is really difficult, yet when you play it, you understand it completely. Hyperdemons seem to have this trait in ungodly amount. Like when you played it, you gain this third eye and ability to see the truth of reality that's otherwise completely inaccessible. And the word I can take this hyperdemon section down to is intuition. Just a visceral and subconscious intuition that is special to games. A complete reprogramming of the player's brain to be able to see what they couldn't before. I talked about hyperdemon and how it inspired me to some of my friends in really long-winded ways. I didn't realize that intuition was the word that I was looking for till one of my friends played 1D and he used the word intuition to describe his experience of how he was beginning to understand the game. And so now that that's all out of the way, given the background of my frustration with my main project and my interest in experimental ideas, one day I was scrolling through itch.io using the experimental tag, and I remember looking at a bunch of games and seeing how short they were, and just sitting there thinking like, man, I would love to make a game that's only 20 minutes long. So sitting there, I tried to think of my own experimental and short ideas, and 1D platformers is something that I had thought about before, but I didn't know how it could be done. Something clicked this time. I had the solution, which is the solution that's in the game. Here's a few texts with my friends at the moment I came up with it. So not long after that, I accepted that I was burnt out on Appraisal, and I decided to work on the 1D game as a creative break. So I started with the premise of I'm at least going to make a prototype. If the prototype is a bust, hey, I'll go back to Appraisal, and I'm at least glad that I tried. And the concept of 1D, as far as a small project goes, it is inherently self-limiting due to the amount of options that I have to communicate, since I only have one dimension to do it in, the different types of objects, the different types of actions, the inherent amount of information that can be kept in that space is a lot less than in a 2D or a 3D game. I do think that there's a lot more that can be done with the game, but it was still an easier game to keep within scope. Especially with that in mind, it was easy to not include a narrative, even though I'm usually somebody who comes up with narrative ideas. It was very easy to not inject a narrative into this or feel the need to inject a narrative. I usually like having narratives and stuff. I like to try to have some sort of meaning, but the experiment of communicating with the player solely through the game and tapping into that deeper intuition or reprogramming the player's game, that was a sufficient amount of meaning to me. And through its exploration of the medium and the interesting way in which it abstracts a traditional 2D platformer into a new perspective, that exploration alone felt worthwhile and meaningful enough to me. Now let's talk about how I actually made it. If you've seen the game, you saw how I made it. 1D is a lie. It is all fake. The game is actually a 2D platformer running in the background. That's where all the physics, game logic, collision, all of that stuff happens on the actual 2D game in the background. The 1D scene is literally just sprites that change color. There's no collision or anything. That's it. It's just pictures. It's all fake. So to explain that in more detail, let's take a look at the objects. So each object has its own 2D version and 1D versions. So to use the player as an example, here's the 2D player. It has all of the player's controls, it has the player's collisions, it has everything on it. Now, on the 1D version, all that it has on it is this sprite renderer and translation script. So the translation script is the lifeblood of all the 1D objects. So if we open this bad boy up and take a look, what these scripts do is trace the X and Y position of whatever object they're following. So in the player objects case, what the 1D script is doing is tracing the position of the 2D version of the player. So the X position on the 1D object is adjusted to match the X position of the 2D object. So with the X axis, it's normal. It's when we get to the Y position, which is where the 1D magic actually happens. And it's all actually quite simple, really, and it takes place with the sprite sorting layer and the sprite color. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is layers. So in Unity, sprites are sorted into layers, sort of like pieces of paper that are in front of each other. So the 1D sprite layer is on a layer that's always in front of the 2D layer, and then that cream colored background is between the two, and it acts like a curtain, and I chose that color because it's easy on the eyes rather than just plain white. Then the sorting order is exactly like layers, but within each layer, you can think of it as layers within layers. So in the 1D layer, stuff that is a higher number shows up in front of stuff that's a lower number. So in the context of 1D, the Y value is mapped to the sprite's sorting order. So again, using the player as an example, if we look at this visual, when the player is below the object, the player's sprite appears like it's below it. And when the player is above the object, the player's sprite appears like it's above it. Pretty simple. The color works in a similar way. So the Y value of the object, again in this case the player, is what determines the color. So let's take a look at the code for that. We start out with this array of colors for the player to change between. I chose the rainbow colors because they're a recognizable pattern that's easy to learn and has that built-in subconscious intuition rather than some arbitrary order of colors that I made up. From there, I read the player's position to determine where they are relative to the array. For example, if their Y value is 1, I check what 1 is on the array. And then from there, I can use this alert function to get the color at their current position. To explain what that function is let's say that Y equals 0 is the color black and Y equals 1 is the color white. If the player is at Y value 0.5, the color is a middle gray. If it's at Y value 0.25, a dark gray, and 0.75 is a light gray. So what this function does is it gets the appropriate color between a set of established colors. And that's what lets the player translate smoothly between this set of rainbow colors as their Y value changes. And then from there, I take that new color, change the color of the player's material, and boom, ta-da, we're done. That's it. That's the core of everything that runs the colors within the game. And then the next component of how I made the game is how did I design the levels? So as we've already discussed, the game actually takes place in 2D, so I designed all of the levels in 2D, which begs the follow-up question, how did I make the 1D levels? And the answer to that is in another translation script. So this translate script carries a lot of power. The one that I showed you controls the player's moment to moment, but this level translate script builds the 1D version of the game at runtime. It's honestly kind of a crude tool, and it would not be my solution if I was making a larger game, but for the context of this game, it works, and it works really well. So what it does is, if we look in the scene hierarchy, all the 2D objects are inside an object called 2D objects. So everything within 2D objects gets copied. So all the floors, the goal, the enemies, coins, everything. But they're copied in different ways. The level obstacles are literally just copied. Their Y values are put to 0. So the stack of levels, all of them go to Y value 0. Their colliders are removed. and their sorting order and color is adjusted to their height, exactly like the player's sorting order and color were adjusted. And then all of the enemies, they actually have a 1D variant. So these variants are spawned and then linked to their 2D variants, and just like the 1D player, the link is being tracked through a translate script, which each enemy tracks its associated 2D enemy. So that allows them to do color changes. And again, the 1D enemies are just colored pictures, and that's it. So with this script, the design workflow of the 1D levels is really easy because I don't have to create 1D levels. I design a 2D version, and every change I make, once I press that run button, it automatically turns into 1D, and I can test it, go back to 2D, make incremental changes, and that whole part being entirely automated makes level designing, testing, experimenting, iterating very fast. In order to talk about design decisions, I believe that going over the design philosophies that I approach the game with is going to be a good starting place. So if you listen to the history section at the beginning, this won't surprise you, but the core idea that every decision was based around was it has to fit into the 1D. If something has a trace of being 2D, it can't be in it. The pause menu breaks that rule, but we can ignore that for now. So the main reason I gave myself this limitation was, well, it's the whole point of the experiment. What's the point of making a 1D game if it's not really striving to be as 1D as it reasonably can be? For example, after the first playtest, I had some friends mention things like some of the enemies could be different shapes, or some of these other things could be different shapes, or have horizontal lines in them to help the player differentiate between them. And that would make the enemies more clear, but it betrays the entire concept. So I had to say no. I was very focused on this design pillar, and that commitment is what I think made the game feel more focused and more interesting. Even text was prohibited. The shape of letters would imply the existence of 2D, which again goes against the entire 1D commandment. This dedication also spilled into another core design principle for this project: communication, specifically nonverbal. The ability for the game to be able to communicate with the player on its own merits. The game being able to communicate with the player, and the player being able to develop an understanding and intuition based upon their dialogue with the game. The most succinct way of saying this, and the line I used as a driving goal oftentimes, was, I want the player to be able to see the 2D space within the 1D representation. This theme was so important to me that I actually told very few people that I know about this project as I was working on it. When I sent some friends my first prototype, I'd literally not even told them that I was making a game at all, and if I did, I gave them no details. This is because the 1D idea is quite an abstract way to visualize a game, so if I explained it to somebody and how it worked, it would give it away. So I kept people in the dark and tested to see if the game stood its ground on its own in helping the player understand the game without any biasing knowledge. This is simply because a stranger is not going to have me having explained the concept to them when they go and play the game. So if I can't test with the similar experience that a stranger is going to go in with, I think that would be insufficient testing to see if the game does communicate alone on its own for somebody who's not had the game explained to them. And so with these fundamentals out of the way, we can talk about more specific mechanics and features. So let's go over some specific design examples. So the first one is coins and the point of the experiment. So the original plan for this game, in my mind, had no coins. It was a simple platformer about getting from one end of the level to the other. And what I quickly realized is the player can easily glide through the levels, and not interact with the 1D-ness in any meaningful way. The question this problem posed is, how can I get the player to interact with the 1D-ness in a more meaningful way? The solution was to use an existing platformer trope, coins or other items that you pick up, and those items unlock the goal. So the game no longer becomes a normal game of point A to point B and just in a 1D perspective. It becomes a puzzle that you have to explore and experiment with and understand in order to collect all these items that allow you to progress, which is a much more meaningful exploration of the perspective and ties back to the focus and point of the experiment. The coins are also my primary guiding and teaching tool within the game. Like how in Mario games the coins can be used to guide the player, I do the same thing. Let's take the early levels for example. When the second layer gets introduced, I put one coin on top and one coin below. This forces the player to interact with the layer in both of its contexts. The fact that you can go above it by jumping and go below it by just running under it. This type of teaching pattern with the coin is used across the entire game every time I have something to teach. And if it's not being used to teach or guide the player, it's being used to make the player engage with the space. So further, how levels are designed, the 1D perspective makes the game inherently more challenging. As I designed levels and tested, I began to lean away, mostly, from being a precision platformer. Simplicity and focus on the exact thing that I'm trying to communicate became the clearest way to communicate intent. So to an extent, I did find that cluttering information was useful to test the player's ability to read the space, as well as places where I deliberately bait the player. But for the most part, simplifying the level geometry made it the most interesting way to deliberately and meaningfully explore the 1D space. And so this gets into level progression and how I design level progression. So again, the focus was on communication. Since being simple and focused seemed to work best, what I focused on while making levels was communicating to the player in isolated exercises how the different components of the game work, and how each of these components work within different contexts. To be quite honest, 65% of the levels in the game are tutorials. 20 out of 30 levels exist in order to teach you something new. Here's literally the names of them in the files. Doing this was, again, on purpose for a focus on communication. The perspective requires a lot more teaching to help the player even exist in the space, let alone navigate it. It also keeps the flow of the game interesting as it continually builds itself and continually gives the player new information for a majority of the game's runtime. So to illustrate this, I'm going to go over my design process for the first handful of levels. So in this first level, the player only has a few options. So they can run around on the black line and they learn that that's ground. They can jump around and you hear the jump sound, but the only thing they really can do is they see a yellow block, they're going to run towards it. Okay, that's how you get to the new level. The player has now learned what the goal is. On the next level, there is this gray line, so when the player runs into it, they hear this thud, so they know that they can't progress beyond that, so the only option that they have is to jump. And so when they land on that, they have jumped onto it, and their color is orange now. So when they go between the two levels, the player has now learned that different levels have different colors associated with them, and that you have to jump onto these gray blocks. And so they will continue right, find the goal at the end, which they've already learned about, run into it. They've gotten to the next level. So this level teaches the player about the pit, one of the fail states. So the reason this level is after the level that teaches the player about the wall is because the player has learned to try jumping onto something in order to experiment with it. So if the player over the previous levels has not run to the left off the edge, the player might try jumping onto the pit or walking off the edge to see what happens. They have now learned that that absence of anything is a pit, a fail state, and so now they know to jump over it and will walk into the goal to the next level. So this level setup is the exact same as the first level, except there's a coin and the goal is a different color. So what the player is going to try to do is move towards the goal, and they're going to run into the coin. The goal has now changed colors, so the player has learned that this coin unlocks the goal. Now on this next level, the first setup is initially the same as that previous level, except to the left there's this landmass. So if they run into the coin, they're going to find that the goal did not change colors. They might try to run into the goal. They can't get into it. So they've seen the landmass on the left. They're going to try going over there. Now right here is a little bit of practice for the wall. The player has to, again, jump over it, get this coin, and then jump onto it to get this last coin. But pay attention to the sound right here. That doo-doo-doo-doo is the sound of you have gotten all of the coins. So when the player goes back, they will see that the goal is unlocked. And so I could keep doing this for just about every level, since I said like 65% of them are tutorial levels. But this kind of specific communication and teaching of different contexts and how the mechanics work within the world is consistent across every single level. If the level's purpose isn't just one thing, it will often be split into multiple different exercises within an individual level. Up next is how I designed the enemies. The premise for all the enemies was pretty simple. Again, the whole point of the experiment was to explore the 1D perspective in a meaningful way. To make the game more readable, I have the enemies the same rainbow color pattern as the player based on their Y value. This makes it easy to understand the position of the enemies relative to the player, since they follow the same rules. The first enemy is the most simple. Legally, I must say it's not a Goomba, but effectively this Goomba style enemy works as a simple and predictable enemy to easily fill the level with obstacles. I can stick them just about anywhere to make the player play more cautiously and take their time to understand a situation, or else there could be the consequence of restarting a level for not understanding the situation correctly. The second enemy is called the bouncer because, as the name suggests, it bounces up in the air. It's simple and predictable, but plays with the 1D idea in a fun way. It only moves up and down on the Y-axis, so it looks stationary while its colors keep changing. When the player encounters the bouncer, they usually have to stop and make sure they understand what role the bouncer takes in the scene and how to navigate it. From there, the player can either jump on it or go under it. It's simple, but challenges the player's understanding of the Y coordinates and color. The final enemy is the shooter, and this fills the role of something that is small and doesn't require the ground. So its bullets can exist anywhere within the Y-axis without needing to be attached to the ground. Like the bouncer, the player can go over or go under the bullets, and so they're a really great tool for temporary moving obstacles that, again, force the player to have a deeper understanding of the game and the color representations of Y-axis value to know the bullet's position relative to the player. And then once the player can get to the enemy, they can destroy that enemy to stop them from shooting. Up next is talking about the prototype and the feedback that I got for it. So after about a week of when I started the project, I got the first prototype out the door and into a few of my friends' hands. When the prototype came out, it only went up to the second layer and had the main enemy and the bouncers as the only enemies, and there were also no sounds. So if you're watching any video of it, the green is actually what became the gray wall. And again, for this prototype, I did not tell at least half of those friends any information about the game. And the feedback that I got overall was quite positive. The issues that I expected people to have ended up being the main issues that were reported, with a few unexpected ones. So for example, in this prototype, like I said, it had no sound. With the limited amount of information this game has in the visual domain, the loss of sound also reduces quite a significant amount of information. So the lack of sound left people fumbling around with less direct feedback, which made pretty much every single element of the game more difficult to understand. The bouncer was a primary suspect for sound issues. I had reports from people telling me that they thought the bouncer was a firewall or something other than what it actually was. Players thought it was an entire wall rising that could damage the player, and for the most part didn't know that they could go under it. They didn't have a concrete understanding of what it was. And then there was the worst bug of the whole prototype that ruined a lot of players' understanding. So there was a bug where sometimes the player didn't need to get all of the coins in order to enter the goal, but it wouldn't always be consistent. Sometimes the goal would be solid, other times the player could simply just phase through the goal and fall off the edge on the other side, and they would have no idea what happened. This was a huge problem and led to a lot of confusion on what to do on some levels. They thought they did everything correctly, but would just die for no reason. No sound feedback made it even more confusing to understand what was going on. It also ruined the entire point of the coins of having the player explore this 1D space as I'm teaching them. So the player could just ignore the coins and sometimes still progress. Other times have to restart the level and they don't know why. Aside from being frustrated, this also led the players to not needing to engage in the 1D space deeply, which meant they didn't have to engage in all the context of things I was trying to teach them, which of course led to diminished understanding of how the rules of the game worked. Otherwise, people enjoyed trying to understand what different elements in the game meant. They found the idea interesting and worthwhile, and that was enough to me to keep going. I also learned a very important lesson about the difference between feedback through words and actually watching somebody play. There's so much experience that is left out in words that is essential feedback to me, or information that isn't properly conveyed, or things that they didn't even know were incorrect, and it would take me watching it to know that that incorrect thing is happening. And the only person I was able to sit down and watch play was my girlfriend, and I learned a lot from watching her play. She does play video games, but she doesn't play platformers, so it was quite a big step for her to go from normal platformers to a 1D platformer, which is in a much more difficult dimension. And while she played, I sat at the other end of the room, didn't say a word, and just watched. She wasn't able to beat it because there was a level in it that was kind of bungus, and the lack of sound also made it very difficult to understand the specific challenge, and also the coin goal bug also caused issues in understanding. So I gained extremely valuable information watching her play, and her inability to beat it showed me a lot of flaws in the design. For example, complexity muddled the understanding. So I simplified some of the levels to give the player more space to experiment with the specific idea I'm trying to teach them. And that bungus level that I mentioned earlier, I simplified that a lot, and I think that's a lot better of a level now. Player control was also another fundamental piece that needed to be improved. The lack of precise location when platforming makes it difficult, even on the x-axis. And after watching her play, I knew that I needed to add coyote time to the game. And for those unaware, coyote time is a short window of time where the player can jump after falling off an edge. So think of Roadrunner, where the coyote would step off a ledge and remain in midair. I implemented coyote time with a pretty generous leeway window, and it made the platforming feel significantly better. This 1D concept does also give quite an imprecision to the player's y-axis location, which makes it difficult to determine when to press jump or when the player has hit the ground after a jump or a fall. I added in the land on ground sound effect as well as a jump buffer to help improve this. So what a jump buffer is it simply stores a jump button press, and if you touch the ground within the time window of having pressed the button, it will use that stored button press and make the player jump immediately. This makes it so that jumps don't have to be frame perfect the moment you hit the ground, thus reducing a lot of the precision required on the y-axis for the platforming, which made everything feel significantly better. And I even included a coyote time after jumping off of enemies to trigger the enemy super bounce, which made that specific jump feel a lot more fair and responsive as well. As one of the final tests that I did with the prototype, I asked a few of my friends to draw what they believed a 2D version of these screenshots looked like, and they were mostly correct with a few misunderstandings. And I took this as my fault as a designer, that I didn't correctly teach them something, and that in general was a really helpful attitude while making the game, since it is a concept that requires so much depth in teaching. I have to do everything I can to make sure that the player understands what's going on and not blame them for their lack of understanding. After the prototype, my focus was on adding a few more mechanics, levels, and improving the readability and communication of the game. Sound effects were one of those big additions, and it made the game feel substantially more responsive and understandable. The sound effects for game feel like jumping when the player lands on the ground, and a very useful one for when the player bonks their head on the ceiling, made understanding what the player was doing in the world a lot easier to understand. And then also the sound effect for the bouncer jumping greatly increased its legibility. I initially wanted to have music in the game, so I spent some time trying to make a song, and the game for a while felt lacking without music until I found something. Here's what the original sound of running into the goal sounded like. For quite a while, this was the goal sound, and every time I tested a level, I began to hate that sound more and more. And so I finally decided to make a new sound, and that's where the current goal sound effect was born. In the program, it sounded good, but when I put it in the game, completing a level felt like a meditative completion of a puzzle. And with that addition, the soundscape felt complete, it felt clear and sort of pure, and I felt like the audio of the game was complete without needing music. That would have distracted further from the game. Then from there, I added the third layer, shooting enemies, and cranked out the levels. Again, it was mostly tutorial levels, as the more layers that got added, the more I needed to show player how all these objects act within these different contexts. At work one night, I used some papers around and managed to jot down some levels with diagrams and notes. Not having the engine in front of me, only paper, at first was really difficult, but it helped me think of unique contexts the objects in the games could interact in, and pretty much all of these ideas on these pictures right here ended up in the game in some format. These ended up being a lot of the end game and more difficult levels, and it was a very productive night at work, I would say. I do think the game is better for having these levels in them, and I'm not sure if I would have come up with them if I was just in front of the engine. Finally, the credits. So I initially wanted to stick with the game solely being 1D, but after a few friends played the prototype, they'd all mentioned in slightly different ways how cool it would be to see the actual 2D space. And at first, because of my focus and commitment, I was against that idea, but it started to warm up to me. It would be fun to see the 2D space, and it gave me an opportunity to thank all the people who helped me out. So I exposed the 2D by simply turning off the background and it gave the player also the opportunity to see what was actually going on, compare what their understanding was to what actually is, and if they wanted to, replay the game with all of that new information. This all culminates in the release of the game, and the last day or two were pretty long. I kept testing the game over and over, finding little bugs or little moments to polish, such as aligning all the coins to be evenly distributed on the platforms or lining up directly in the center of the platforms. That took ages. I sent my friend to build a few times just to make sure it was all clean and to test for any bugs. Nothing that I did at this stage was major, but a lot of minor stuff really added up in making the game look and feel a lot cleaner. And I actually made an itch page quite a few days beforehand just to take a break, and so this ended up coming in handy because when I was all done with the game, all I had to do was upload and press submit, send it to my friends, and await feedback. It's now been a month since I released the game that I'm making this video, and the dust has settled. It seems silly to give an itch game a post-mortem, but throughout this entire process I've taken receiving feedback and iteration very seriously, and so this is the culmination of all that. The feedback that I have received is positive. Probably the nicest thing somebody has said about the game is this quote from my friend right here, and I want to say something wild, but I'm happy with the game, and not to get too hot over myself, but I think it's the best thing I've ever made, which is nice. Some players had difficulty with the last few levels. They could be a bit brutal, and there's quite a number of things I would change if I were to go back, which I did once. I decided to go back and add a save system because the game was taking a lot longer to beat than I expected it. I anticipated about 20 minutes, and that if you didn't beat it in one sitting, you could replay it and it would be super fast because you've already learned all the rules. That was an incorrect assumption and also a really lame reason to not add a save system, because as a player, I would hate that. I also noticed people that I had sent it to would have to save up enough time to play the game, and if they did start it and not beat it, it would take them quite a while to get back around to it simply because it was such a time commitment. And it turns out it takes about 30 minutes or more to beat the game, so saving the game made it a lot more friendly and approachable from a time perspective, and less annoying that you had to replay stuff. What I was most surprised about is how many players got stuck on this level. Every person that I talked to said that they got stuck on this level. What most surprised me about this is that I thought this would be the level that people were going to get immediately. How I designed it is that the only thing you can do is jump off the enemy. If you land on them and crush them, the only option is to jump off the edge and restart. Everybody got stuck on that level, and I honestly have no clue how to design the level any differently because it's the only simple and organized setup that can be done where jumping off an enemy is the only solution, at least as far as for a first time doing it. This particular problem also made me realize how I need to get a wider pool of people who test the game. This friend of mine who tested it, he was the only one who tested the last giant group of levels, and he's also my friend who, one, I talked to the most about the idea. He's the one with the text messages I sent to from earlier. He's also really good at video games and has played the most games of anybody I know and is the most game literate. And then third is making games of his own, so he understands design really well. These attributes of my friend made it so that he was probably the worst person I could have had test the more difficult levels. It did not reveal weaknesses because his hyper gamer brain was able to draw bridges and learn the language of the game a lot faster than a normal player. And when it came to watching people play, I had one person that I was able to watch play the game, and it's the same friend who left the comment as above. I watched him play over a Discord stream where I sat muted until he beat it. He's somebody who's a bit of a platformer head, so his platforming literacy is also higher than your average gamers, which could bias his ability to understand the game a bit. Regardless, I sat there muted and watched as he played. He did get stuck on that level that everybody else did for a moment, but he figured it out in a minute or two. There were a few times in the game where I felt like I would want to change something after getting the opportunity to watch him play, such as that second loop around level. I'd probably make that lip smaller so that it relies less on coyote time. And then on the bouncer loop around level, I'd also show a bit of the ground between the second layer and the bouncer to make it more clear. My favorite part about watching him was that, to take it all the way back to the level design discussion, pretty much everything that I specifically designed for in my levels, he fell for, or he did. Every trap that I laid, every intention of giving the player a moment of epiphany once they realized the puzzle of the level, and then immediately solving it after. And so he did pretty much all of that. And as a designer, it was really satisfying to see all the nuances that I painstakingly designed around pay off. And it was probably one of the proudest I felt about my own work before. So those are the successes. What about the failures, or at least the things that I would like to change? And this is my own suggestions to myself, and with an asterisk here. Right now the game is on version 1.1. If you go and download it and it's on a version 1.2, it's probably going to be a lot of fixes from things I'm about to list here. At the moment, I just consider the project done, but if I go back and do anything, it's going to be fixing a lot of the things that I'm about to list. So one of the first things I do, like I said, I already added a save system, level counter, and a way to restart the game, but I would also like a level selection so that the player can go back and relearn a level, or at least play a level that they liked. I would also want to make the player's movement more precise and controllable. It's usually fine, but it's noticeable in moments where you have to move slowly, that you have to, like tap, 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 because it's too fast or nothing. And a lot of the level design currently works around this little acceleration time, but it does make moments where you need to be slow, like with bullets, control annoyingly, and can lead to you making mistakes that are on the fault of the controls rather than on the fault of the player. I would also like to make the ground slightly visible under the player, maybe like a slight transparency on the player, so that the player can see exactly how they're lined up against an edge. I had one friend mention issues with collision, but the way he described it seemed like it might have come down to an issue of information for exactly where the player was relative to the ground in the X component, and whether they were on a platform or enemy or not, since the player covered up the target. Another control-based thing I would fix is making that jump into the one layer gap a lot easier. If you play the game, you may have found this part difficult, inconsistent, and frustrating. It's when there's a wall and a second layer above it and you need to get into that tunnel. It can be tricky to jump into that hole, and the first times you do it, you keep hearing the head bonk sound, so it sounds like you failed and it might dissuade you away from trying. And so as far as game communication goes, I think this is confusing because the information that you get indicates failure, even if it's the thing you're supposed to be doing, or even if it's a success, you still hear that head bonk, so it's kind of confusing. There's also this bug where if you spam jump, when your head hits a ceiling, you will stay connected to that ceiling. I really have no idea why this happens, because the spot that checks if the player is touching the ground, which thus allows them to jump, is at the player's feet and has a really tiny radius. Either way, I left it in because I didn't think it would be a problem. I only found out it was a real problem, and this is actually how I learned it existed, was by watching my girlfriend play that level that everybody got stuck on. She messed up the jump and went underneath the third layer, but she kept spamming the jump, and this led to her sticking to the ceiling, so it almost looked like a success because she hadn't died yet, and because the auditory feedback was telling her she was still alive, but it was actually a failure. This is the primary time that it shows up, but there are a few other spots that I found where this bug could confuse the player's understanding of the rules and lead them to play the game with an incorrect set of assumptions based upon real feedback that the game has given them. Then there's quite a number of small level changes that I'd make, like that loop around level that I mentioned earlier. On level 16, I think it's a bit long and it's frustrating to the player if they mess up since it's such a long level. In the credits, I would offset the 1D view a bit because right now it blocks quite a bit of the view of the 2D mode, which makes it harder to get a complete understanding of the actual 2D picture, but it also messes up the player's understanding of the 1D. Such as this shooter section in the credits is actually quite a bit confusing, and everybody I've watched play this part of the level has ended up trying to meticulously jump over every bullet rather than just running under them, because their view is blocked and it looks like there are 2 bullets. And then a big one is level 23. And the entire point of my design was completely messed up, and I would change this level quite a lot. So looking at the level, the entire point of the level was for the player to have to cross the top to get all the coins on the 3rd layer and then make their way back across the top. And then there are these 2 sentries on the side and then 2 enemies. So the trick was that if the player was in the mood to destroy all the enemies, they would first destroy the enemies on the 3rd layer, and that would stop the enemies from blocking the bullets, which made the players platforming back the way they came a lot more difficult. So the trick was to actually leave the enemies alive, and then the level would actually be really easy. What completely trivialized and messed up the level is everything right below that. Once you get all the coins, you can just drop back to the bottom level and make your way back to the goal with no problems at all. I don't know why it did not enter my head. I'm not sure why I had that entire runway. I'm going to assume it was to communicate to the player that they had to get all of these coins and that there was a shooter on the left as well. But that mistake ruined the purpose of what I thought was an otherwise fun concept that took a twist on the player's propensity of destroying enemies and them doing that, making the level harder. And I literally didn't realize this mistake was there till I watched my friend play. Once he got all the coins, he dropped down, and in that moment I saw the mistake and I saw my inability to see what I had actually created, with my eyes being clouded by this fun solution. And then one of the final things I would change is there's this general bug, which is if the player is on the wall and they have a little bit of them hanging off and the enemy runs under that end of the player that's hanging off, it will destroy the enemy. This is just because the enemy's collider extends a little bit beyond them and the player's collider extends a little bit below them. So even though they shouldn't be touching, these colliders touch and that destroys the enemy. And this is mainly a problem because it confuses the player, like they'll be sitting there on the ledge with the enemy going under them and then the enemy just disappears and the player isn't sure what they did. I heard about this from a few people that played it and it is confusing. At least it shows the player that the enemies can be destroyed, but not in a way that I want to teach them. It is an incorrect teaching of how to do that mechanic. Overall, though, I think it's safe to say and wrap this all up that this game is not perfect and that I'm happy with it. It was a worthwhile experiment and it pushed my own understanding of games. It has me excited for my own future in making games, but now I'm going to go back to working on Appraisal. I really look forward to getting that out the door, hopefully doing some interesting stuff, and then making more games. I think I'm making games for good. Anyway, thanks for watching. Take it easy.